Hello everyone, welcome back. So in previous lecture, we have created a user registration form, user entity and role entity, right? So we are able to successfully register and also we are able to assign a role to particular user, right? So in this lecture, we are going to discuss about Spring Security and we are going to enable Spring Security to our web application. So how we can secure our web application with the help of Spring Security. So before learning Spring Security, so who are all watching newly, you can subscribe my channel Java Cafeteria and Java Palace. Both two channels are available. So you can subscribe and you can watch all the videos and you can learn Spring Boot, Angular JS, and Spring Data JDBC, Spring Data JPA, microservices, and writing JUnit test cases, Spring Security, and JWT, and OAuth authentication, and also you can learn logical project development skills so that you can learn everything in the channel, guys. Okay. So in this lecture, I am going to explain you Spring Security. So before learning Spring Security, first you should understand few basic concepts. Like let me explain you Spring Security. So before learning Spring Security, you must have knowledge on authentication. Authentication and second one authorization. Okay, so if you understand authentication and authorization, you guys can implement Spring Security very easily and you can understand all as well. So authentication nothing but, so whenever, so if you take any one of the website or you can take Flipkart, Amazon, or your banking application or any application. If you take example, so before accessing their resources, first you should log into your application, right? So while logging into application, you have to enter username and credential password, right? So the moment you entered username and password, then only you can able to access their application, right? So here the username and password, once user is entered, once he is able to successfully log into the any one of the application, then this concept is nothing but authentication. So in authentication, what will happen? It will verifies user identity. So authentication nothing but verifies user identity or verifying user identity. So identifying user in any one of the application is nothing but authentication. So example, so any application you can log in by entering username and password is nothing but authentication. And second one, authorization. Authorization nothing but the moment user authenticated successfully, user can see the home page, right? So that time, what are all the resources user can access or permissions? Nothing but authorization. So authorization nothing but it will check user permissions and user access. So once you log into the application, only if you log in it as a guest user, you might have some resources to access. If you log in as a admin, then you might have few more options to access the application. So authorization is nothing but it will checks user access, authenticated user access. So this is what you can understand what is authentication and what is authorization. I hope you guys are understood, right? So now I will explain you how Spring Security works internally and what is the execution flow of Spring Security. So let me explain you in detail. If you check in this diagram, you can see the moment user send the request, nothing but once he entered the username and password into any application, so request will go to earlier request will directly go to the dispatch servlet and then controller. So after that remaining flow will be executed. So the moment you enable Spring Security to our web application, so first request will go to authentication filter. So I hope you guys are aware of it, right? What is filter? So if you learn servlets and filter concepts, so whenever you are writing one filter in your application, so whenever you are sending particular request, first request will go to the filter only. So the moment you enable Spring Security to our Spring Boot application or your web application or your RESTful API, so request will go to authentication filter. So after that authentication filter will check user credentials in security context. So authentication filter will have security context. So authentication will check whether that user credentials are already exist in security context or not. If it is not available, then authentication filter will uses authentication manager. So authentication manager will check user identity. So how it is? So authentication manager will check again, will use again authentication provider. So all username details and password details will be verified in authentication provider. So once authentication is success, so then in the same direction response will go back to authentication filter. So authentication filter, if it is identifies user credentials successfully, and then based on the success handler, authentication will send response back to the user. So in Spring Security, you have to understand these concepts. So what all the classes are involved in Spring Security? Authentication filter is one of the class, and remaining authentication manager and user detail service and remaining everything will be interfaces. So let me explain you in detail. So during the Spring Security execution flow, first authentication filter will be called filter. So after that authentication manager. Authentication TION. So after that authentication provider. So authentication provider will uses user detail service, and Next, password encoder. So these are all the four steps are involved in Spring Security execution. So the moment user send request from the client or web browser, so what will happen? So request will come to authentication filter, and then authentication will uses authentication manager, and authentication manager will use authentication provider to check user identity and user credentials whether those are present in database or not. So those are all available in security context or not. So once it is available, user successfully able to authenticated. If credentials are not available in security context, then user authentication filter will send response back to failed authentication message. Okay, so let me explain you one more time. So if you check in the diagram, so once user enters the username and password, so request will go to the authentication filter. So authentication filter is having security context. So authentication filter will check whether user information is available in security context or not. If it is present, then immediately it will return success response to respective user. If it is user details are not present in security context, and then authentication filter will use authentication manager. So authentication manager will check user identity. How authentication manager will check? Authentication manager will take help from authentication provider. So authentication manager will use authentication provider to check user identity details. So authentication manager provider again internally it will use user detail service to identify respective user, and user password will be verified with password encoder. So by using user detail service and password encoder, authentication provider will check whether user exists or not. If it is exist or not, so response will came back to authentication manager, and again authentication manager will send a result to authentication filter. Then authentication filter will check if it is success, then successful response will be is sent back to user. If it is failed message will send back to user. So this is how Spring Security internally it works. So how we are going to implement that I will explain you in later. Okay, so before and also we have different kinds of authentications available in Spring Security. One is basic authentication. So what kind of authentication it is? Basic authentication. So basic authentication. So Spring Boot or Spring Security by default will provide basic authentication to our web application or RESTful web application. So by default, Spring Security will provide basic authentication. So but basic authentication is nothing but it will provide username and default username and default password uh, to log into your application. So we can customize this we can customize this authentication process later. Now is there a form based authentication also available? Another one, form based authentication. Form based authentication nothing but, so once user enters user can have user can enter username and password, and then he can authenticate it with the help of form based authentication, like web page based authentication. Okay, so there are so many authentication related concepts are available, OAuth and token based authentication. So those things we can discuss later. So as of now we can discuss about only Spring Security. Later I will explain you what are all available authentication methods. Okay, so Spring Security will provide basic authentication by default, so we no need to do any configuration for that. So now let me explain you how we can implement Spring Security in our Spring Boot application and how we are going to enable Spring Security to our web application. So go to the Eclipse and then open your pom.xml, control shift R. So for control shift R to open the resource. Okay, so pom.xml and then pom.xml will have dependencies, right? So here we need to add security dependency, Spring Security dependency. Let me copy this dependency, web dependency, and paste it here. There is a starter security hyphen security. You can see Spring Boot starter security dependency. So if you want to enable Spring Security to your web application or REST API, so we must include this dependency in pom.xml. This is the first step to enable Spring Security into our web application or RESTful API. So now let me save this dependency. So once we add the dependency, it will download from the Maven repository, right? So now whenever any modification done in our web application, we must update the project. Make sure whenever you are modifying the pom.xml, we must update the project. Right click on the project, Maven, and select update project. Click on force update and click on OK. So if you don't update, your application will not work properly. Okay, so now you can see application started successfully. So now if you open the console, why application is not started properly? So let me stop the server and let me clear the console. Now again let me start the server. Yeah, application started successfully. So whenever you are adding dependency, right, sometimes project will not build properly. So what you have to do, you have to right click on the project and you have to update the project properly. If it is still not working, what you have to do, you have to stop the server and then restart the server. Now our application started successfully. So now Spring Boot security is enabled to our web application. So how do you know that? I told you, right? Spring Security will provide basic authentication. You can see there is a password generated here. So if you check the console, user generated secure using generated security password. So this is the password to log into our application. So you may have doubt now, sir, we have not created a login page. How we are going to log in? So Spring Security will provide default login page. The moment we add the Spring Security in our pom.xml, so Spring Security will provide default web page, nothing but default to login and logout pages to our web application. So we no need to create a login page and we no need to create logout page. So by default, Spring Boot security will provide login and logout features. So now let me go to the browser. Now if you refresh this localhost colon 8080, we'll see what will happen. See, by default, Spring Security is providing login page. So the moment I entered localhost colon 8080, so before enabling Spring Security, what is the web page it should load again? Sorry, what is the web page is used to load earlier? So registration form is used to load earlier, right? So now the moment we enabled Spring Security, so when the moment I typed localhost colon 8080, so now login page is displayed. So this page is coming from Spring Boot Security. So Spring Security by default it is providing login page. So we no need to create login page. So by default Spring Security is providing login page once we have enabled Spring Security in our web application. So this we can customize later also. We can create our own custom login page also, that will do it later. So now how we can log into our application? So we have to enter username and password. So the user default username will be user. So Spring Security by default username will be user, and password will be, so the moment you start the server, right, Spring Security will provide password to log in to our web application. So this is the password we have to use to log in. So let me copy this password and paste it here and click on, let me before, let me enter wrong password, we'll see what will happen. If you enter wrong password, click on sign in, you can see bad credentials. So now let me enter user and the password which I have copied from the console, paste it here. Now let me click on sign in button. Now we can see our registration page we are able to view now. So after enabling Spring Security, so we must authenticate first, otherwise we cannot access none of the URLs in our web application. Without authenticating, our Spring Security will not allow to access any of the URL in our Spring Boot web application. So I hope you understood, right? So sir, we have logged in successfully. So how we can log out? So log out, so Spring Boot Security can provide logout page as well. So what you have to do, we just need to type logout URL. So by default I told you, right, so Spring Security will provide us login and logout pages by default. So now just you need to type logout. The moment you click on logout, so see Spring Security is provided one of the web page. Are you sure you want to log out? Yes, click on logout. That's it, immediately it will redirect to login page. It's very simple, guys. So enabling Spring Security in our Spring Boot application is very easy. So what you have to do, you have to go to the pom.xml and then add the Spring Security dependency, starter dependency. So starter hyphen security, just copy any one of the starter dependency and then paste it here and just change security. So Spring Boot starter security dependency we need to add and then update your project, and then the moment you open the browser, once you start the server, so let me show you again. So let me stop the server now. Let me refresh the page. So server is, I stop, right, nothing is working. So now let me start the server. So what will happen, so now whenever you are restart the server every time, so Spring Security will create new password to log in to our web application. Okay, so see now it is another password is generated by Spring Security. Copy this password. So earlier password, previous password will not work. Now this is the password only will work. So let me copy the password and go to the browser and refresh the URL. So directly it is directly login page displayed, right? So now let me enter the user and paste the password and sign in. So now we can able to successfully view user registration page. So you can register any one of the user. Let me register um, Bumrah, Jaspreet Bumrah, Bumrah. and email id will be boomra@gmail.com and password will be tested123. Click on submit button. Error page. Why the application has no explicit mapping? Yes, so earlier it used to log in save user, right? So the moment we enable the Spring Security, so Spring Security, we have to redirect to specific URL. We have to configure that, so that we'll do later. Okay, so currently it is saying forbidden nothing but unauthorized. So because we have to specify, we have to write the authentication logic for that. Okay, so now by default you can see, by default Spring Security is enabled to our web application. Sorry, by default the login page and logout pages are enabled to our web application. So later I will show you how we can customize this. Okay, so some people may have doubt now, sir, how I can create uh, every time I need to, whenever I'm starting the server, so a new password is generating. So is there any fixed username and password can we give or not? So obviously we can give. So how we can give? So whenever you are now what is happening? Whenever we are restarting the server, every time new password is generated. So we can configure our own password in our application.properties file. So whenever you are restarting the server, you can use those credentials to log in to our web application. So let me stop the server now. What I will do, go to our application.properties, control shift R, type application.properties, open. So here we can give our own hard coded username and password. How we can give? Let me provide spring dot, let me add proper spring dot security dot user dot name is equal, I will give Java cafeteria. Okay, Java cafeteria, and password I will give spring dot security dot user dot password. So these two properties we need to add. Password I will give test is the password. I just saved the application.properties file. So if you add these two properties in our application.properties, so whenever you are restarting the server, so you no need to, so Spring Security will not generate the password. So our Spring Security or authentication filter always use these two credentials. Sorry, this is the username and this is the password we'll use to authenticate our web application. So let me open the console, clear the console, nothing is there. Let me start the server. Now you can see this time Spring Security will not generate the password. Now you can see, right, Spring, our application started successfully, right? Tomcat started successfully. If you observe, there is no password generated. Why? Because we have configured default password in our application dot properties. Now we can log in with these credentials. Let me go to the browser, let me copy the username and password will be test, right? So refresh the page, so it is directly take me to login page. So now what is the default username? So now I have earlier user, right? Now we have to give Java cafeteria. Now what is the password? Test is the password. So now let me sign in. Click on sign in button. Now successfully we are able to access our user registration page. So now let me stop the server and again start the server. As many number of time if you start and start, so Spring Security context always use these credentials to log into our web application. Now again, so I have restarted the server, right? So now refresh the page, refresh the URL, again copy the Java cafeteria and password will be test. Click on sign in button. So how we can log out? So you just need to type logout URL and click on enter. So now you just need to click on logout button. So this is how Spring Security will provide basic authentication and also login and logout pages by default. We no need to do anything, we just need to add the dependency. Basic authentication as well as login and logout pages will be provided by Spring Security by default. So how we are going, so in real time environment this will not help us. In production environment, basic authentication we should not use. So we have to customize this authentication process. So in next lecture I will teach you how we can customize this authentication process. So whatever username we have registered in our registration page, so we have to log in with those credentials. So for that we need to customize our authentication filter. So you guys have to practice one time. So in next lecture I will teach you how we can customize our authentication logic. Okay guys, we'll catch you in next lecture. Thank you.